Namaste. Psychoanalysis and spirituality. Life after environment. In our last two episodes, we have discussed the meaning of the word enlightenment and the paths to it. In today's episode, we shall be discussing what life is like after the enlightenment experience. For this, we have with us our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Sir, is there a life after environment? Enlightenment, sorry.
Uh, the question is enlightenment a comma or a full stop?
Right.
There is a basket full of opinions constituting a full spectrum of beliefs. And these beliefs are not just beliefs, they are coming from true experiences. Which means we are dealing here with a diversity of experiences and a very uh, pluralistic phenomena. On one extreme, we have one group which says that enlightenment is the last event that happens in life. And once the soul is freed from the body, or once the soul is enlightened, it gets free from the body. And therefore, there is no question of life after enlightenment. Enlightenment itself is the culmination of spiritual life. So this is one extreme. Slightly less extreme than this is the uh, school of what is called Avdut, where people who get enlightened, they don't leave their body, they are in their body, but they don't do anything. Even for their own self-care, it's minimum that they do. They survive on food which people bring to them, or at times they don't even go out in search of food if they don't get one. This is on the one extreme of the spectrum. The other extreme of the spectrum, people say that enlightenment actually is a comma, not a full stop, and the real uh, good life begins after enlightenment. Before enlightenment is the life of ignorance, slavery of passions, and lack of freedom. After enlightenment is the real, free, good, and pure life, and this life is good, pure, efficient, and far more effective, creative, and productive compared to the life before enlightenment. And on this spectrum, we have people like Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Krishna, Guru Gobind Singh. And in between are people who, after enlightenment, do work, but mostly of the spiritual or intellectual nature. Maybe a bit of social work, but they don't get into very difficult, very demanding jobs like politics or war or conflicts. So we have a full spectrum of people. On one hand, we have those who see enlightenment as the last event of life. Then we have near to them the Avaduts. Then we have the Buddhist and the Jain tradition enlightened people. Then we have somebody like Osho or J. Krishnamurti who uh, go about trying to bring about a change in society by spreading spiritual knowledge and helping people on the spiritual path. But they don't get into social or political work. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people like Krishna or Guru Gobind Singh or Pandurang Shastri Athavale, who actually go into the thick of things in the society and try to make a difference. So we have this full spectrum, and I think it's a minority opinion to say that there is no life after enlightenment. The majority opinion is that there is a much better life after enlightenment, and there is a view that as our evolution proceeds forward in the next 50 to 100 years, we will have far more enlightened people, and the possibility of creating a society where a substantial number of people are enlightened is not a dream, it is a realistic possibility. So we may not only have life after enlightenment, we may have actually a society where a substantial number or even a majority of people are living a life together post enlightenment.
So, from what you said, there is life after enlightenment. So, the life of the person enlightened gets kind of transformed. Can we say that? Or
Yes,
is it something?
yeah, there is a continuity and there is a change.
Okay.
So, a person who is enlightened, he lives a life which is ethically much superior to a normal person. In terms of thought, he is very clear. He gets into the state of no mind on demand. He is able to be in a state of bliss and happiness without dependence on outer events. So, in terms of happiness, awareness, clarity of thought, use of intuition, and use of mystical powers, he is very different from a normal person. At the same time, he is not omnipotent. It is not that he can change the laws of nature or he can stop people from suffering or dying or accelerate somebody on the path of spirituality, on the enlightenment path itself, uh, at a very great speed. So they are themselves have their own limitations, their own karmic and natural limitations. It is also not true that they don't suffer anything. Many of them also have physical problems, which despite their spiritual enlightenment, they still have to suffer. So there is a continuity and there is a change. The good part is the continuity is harmless and change is for the good.
Okay. Do we have real life accounts from history and even in the present of such people whom we call spiritual masters?
Let us take example of 7 different people to take a look at the whole spectrum of diversity. Take Ramakrishna Paramhans. He lived a life, most of it was in the temple. He never went out to change the society. He never participated intensely in the freedom struggle. He did not go to war with a Mughal emperor. So his was one kind of life that he would focus on himself, get enlightened, and then help others to move on the spiritual path towards enlightenment. And with whatever mystical powers he has, or whatever uh, access he has to God or to the powers of nature, he uses for the good of others. But most of his life was confined to the temple. So that is one life, Ramakrishna Paramhans. In his life, we see post enlightenment, most of the life is in the temple, most of the life is spent in helping people on the spiritual path and helping people in general, but only those who come to the temple for help. Contrast that to his disciples. Second example, Swami Vivekananda, who did not spend much of his life in the temple like his master. His life, most of it was spent doing good to the society, traveling across India, traveling across the world, setting up ashrams, doing social service to people through those ashrams, working in education, working in health, working in the area of culture, publishing books, giving lectures, doing intellectual work. So his was a very different kind of life, far more socially active, far more out there in society and not in the temple. Take the third one, Sri Aurobindo. He had his experience of no thought, and after that actually went intensely into the freedom struggle. So he was already in the freedom struggle, but the uh, intensity increased, did not reduce after his experiences with a yogi with whom he has sat down and he had a experience of no thought and possibly some other experiences also. And Sri Aurobindo also always used to say that I want to get enlightened for doing more work, not less. So his enlightenment was very different after experience of enlightenment, as we usually call it, but in his own view, that was the first step out of the four-step process. So he experienced the first step, continued with his freedom struggle, did it even more, and when he was put into prison, he had the second experience of oneness with existence. And then, of course, he went on, but it was a very different life, and he uh, always was for doing work after enlightenment. He was not for liberation, he was for transformation, both individual transformation and collective transformation. And therefore, his life was very different because he wanted to establish a perfect, not a perfect, but a divine society on earth. And therefore, his experiments included creating a full society based upon spiritual principles, which is what Auroville was an expression of. So it's a very different uh, post enlightenment life. Then we come to uh, Osho and J. Krishnamurti. J. Krishnamurti traveled around the world post enlightenment trying to help people intellectually and spiritually. On the spiritual paths, of course. I don't mean intellectually in the scientific sense of the term, but on the spiritual path, those who were, he would lecture around the world, meet people to help them. But he did not try to create a spiritual principle based society like Sri Aurobindo did or Osho Rajneesh did. Osho Rajneesh underwent two different phases of his life. First phase was he went out in the society to deal with political, economic, social problems and change the society. And that was post enlightenment. Post enlightenment, he went about trying to change the society. He failed. His original cassettes are still available. They are titled Bharat Ke Jalte Prashna, the burning questions of Indian society. And at that point, if you look at his lectures, they are on politics, they are on economics, they are on society, they are on all sorts of general things. So his first part of life, and then he failed, he could not change society. Then he went into the commune creation, where he tried to create a society based upon spiritual principles that he believed in. It was a very different set of principles than Sri Aurobindo's principles, but both of them essentially were geared towards the spiritual goal through different paths. So the culture was different, value system was different, but the spiritual goals had a commonality. And then we have somebody like UG Krishnamurti, who post enlightenment spent much of his life in criticizing enlightenment itself and all those people who claim to be enlightened. So we see and then we have people like Pandurang Shastri, who went out to change the society, and we have people like Guru Gobind Singh, who waged a war post enlightenment and actually died on the battlefield. So he had put forward the ideal of the saint soldier. So we have this full spectrum of people, uh, how they live differently post enlightenment, and all of these are historical figures, very recent in history. They are not from mythology.
Right. Post enlightenment, what determines their orientation towards withdrawal or involvement with the world?
I think if we analyze a large number of people post enlightenment, the way they have lived, we come down with something like 4 to 5 principles on this point. The first is their own soul journey and their own karmic load. Because in some cases, the karmic load is not fully exhausted with enlightenment. A substantial part of karmic load is exhausted, but some part remains, and that gets worked out either through work or through body. Many people have some sicknesses which are psychosomatic, where the remnant of karma is working out. So, one factor that affects is the one factor that affects the post enlightenment nature of life is the self journey and the karma. The second thing that affects is the path one has followed towards enlightenment. People who follow the path of the no are more likely to get into the withdrawal mode or something near to it. And people who have followed the path of the yes, the path of engagement, the path of experience, the path of social change, they are more likely to keep working. And this is where at present, if you look at, you can look at Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, you can look at Jaggi Vasudev. They are deeply involved in social work of all types. So the second is the path that you follow towards enlightenment. The third is the necessity of outer world. Because when in an inner sense you don't have any personal desire or attachment, the necessity of the outer world often propels people to do or not do something. The fourth is the intuition. Many of these enlightened, post-enlightenment experienced people, many of these people with enlightenment experiences get intuition that they must do certain things. It's an inner call, and that makes them do something. And the fifth is situation arranges itself and comes to them in a way that they are just naturally sucked into the flow and they just respond to it. These five, I think, are the major determining factors that govern what they do or don't do post enlightenment. And of course, if you go deeper, you can link the intuition or the necessity or the arranging of situation to a larger destiny of the universe. So you can link it to the larger destiny. You can link it to personal karma or collective karma if you go deep enough in that way.
Then we come to our next question. How do you see the difference in the working of their minds? I mean, working of the mind of an enlightened person and a non-enlightened person.
I would look at it in a way on few criteria. The first is the presence of peace, bliss, and contentment. Because this is with an enlightened person, and I have seen a few of them, the peace, bliss, and contentment is very high. Two, the clarity and the cessation of thought is there. Three, the emotional turmoil out of fear and desire, which is present in the normal human being, is not there. Fourth, the clarity of thought and intuition is very high. Fifth, the mystical powers are available to different degrees. Sixth, there is a sort of communion with God or nature, and because of that, they are able to get certain things done, which a normal person cannot do. And seven, some of them have access to some other realms of forces or beings or powers. Uh, at times, certain occult knowledge which is not available to a normal person. These are the core differences, the way the mind works post enlightenment. The similarities also are there. It is a break with continuity, it's not a total break. So the continuity is that they still have to think things out. They are good in intuition, which gets into a yes no kind of thing, to do or not to do kind of thing, but it is not something which will give you a manual of science. So the detailed scientific knowledge does not just fall from heaven, even for an enlightened person. Then there are obvious limits of what he can do. There is not much they can do politically or socially. They can influence a few people, but it's not that they are able to change the society completely. The evil in the world, the suffering in the world still continues. While they are alive, also it continues, and after they go, also it continues. So the essential human condition is not fundamentally altered because of them or their enlightenment. They are able to make difference in their own small way, but the whole world is too large, and the laws of nature and the laws of karma are too powerful for any of them, and none of them is omnipotent. So they all share the limitedness, the frailness, and the fragility, and also the helplessness that most human beings experience and are subject to.
Do we see the limitations at work and at non-work?
Sorry?
Do we see the limitations at work or non-work?
Yes. Uh, Many of those with enlightenment experiences, they get into work, and some of them lead a more restrained and withdrawn life. But in both situations, we see their limitations. It is not that if an enlightened person starts doing business, everything just happens the way he wants, or that he becomes a teacher, so every student starts knowing what he wants them to know. So that kind of uh, miracles don't happen. Occasionally they happen, but you don't have a moment to moment miracle on a mass scale. You may have occasional miracles at individual scale, but not on a social scale. You don't have miracles at the scale of the law of nature. Nobody cancels gravity or electromagnetism. So that kind of limitations are always there, whether they do work or even if they don't do work. In many of the cases, many times things happen to their own family members which they don't want to happen, but they are helpless, they can't do anything about it. So there is an element of limitation and helplessness for an enlightened person post enlightenment also, regardless of whether they live an active occupational life or they live a more reserved withdrawn life.
This clarifies very well that enlightened people, because normally our understanding is that they have mystical powers, or they have very supernatural powers, or they are like superhuman beings who can change everything.
Yeah. So
This clarifies the point so well.
yeah, so they are slightly more powerful than us, but nobody is omnipotent.
Have you met such people, sir? And if you have, then what has been your experience?
Yes, I have met five of them. two of them, very briefly, just to take their blessings. That was a very brief kind of interaction. I just met them, I touched their feet, I spoke a few words and came back. But three of them I could interact at some length. And based upon that, I have some first-hand insights apart from the reading of the cases that we see. And the three people were very different. All of them had experienced what we call enlightenment, at least the state of no thought and freedom from desire and fear for an extended period of time. The first definition, the most common definition, that at least all the three had experienced. And all the three were very different. The first person was a scholarly person. He was very demanding, intellectual type, scholarly type. He would never give an answer to anything. He would only give you leads and expect you to work hard upon it and come back with more questions. So if you ask him a question, he would only tell you where to read, what to read, and then come back. He would always say, what about the process of knowing? Knowing is good, but what about the process of knowing? Because the process of knowing is as enriching as the answer itself. So he was one person, very scholarly type, very meticulous type, very attention to detail type, the rule of the book type, very demanding type, and a firm believer in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. The second person I met was from the Osho commune. Very different. He was not at all the scholarly type. He was a very practical type, a man of few words, who would believe more in faith and less in reason, and who would not argue much, was not very interested in the intellectual affairs, and he would actually discourage people from intellectual prolonged discussions. He would go only on the essential knowledge, not on the comprehensive knowledge. And he had moved quite a long path from Osho, living in his commune for some time, quite some time, and then to Sai Baba, and many people, many other masters in between. And he was very different. I think he still would be there. I have not met him for almost 20 years, but I think he would still be there. The third person I met was, for the second person, he was partly social. So he would not go out of his house, but people would come to him and he would help them whatever way he could. And mostly it was through mystical powers and faith. And then the third person I met was very different from both of them. He was a retired professor, and he was a social do-gooder. So he would sit, he passed away 2 years back, but he was in Ahmedabad, and in an area of Ahmedabad, he would sit every night from 9 to 12 listening to problems and solving them. And people from all across the city would come to him. And he had a very high degree of occult power. The entire spectrum of the Tibetan yoga, the mantra, he had learned it spending years and years, not years and years in a direct way, but he used to go every summer vacation when the college would be on vacation because he was a professor. So every vacation, every summer vacation, he would go to Himalayas and spend 2 to 3 months there. And this he did almost for 20-25 years. And in that course of going there, learning from experts, he had developed quite some power, especially in the area of mantra. and he used to live a very different kind of life, a full family life, and doing good from 9 to 12 and every day, and helping people whoever would come to him for spiritual guidance. So these three that I have personally met, uh, all the three were very different people, and I think that tells us in a way that the diversity of post enlightenment existence is very high, and it is a continuity of the diversity in individuality that we have even as normal people.
Your answer gets me very curious, sir. That these three people like look like very normal people who are living in the world. They are not like some saints or something living outside of the society.
Yes,
So how do you differentiate that this person is enlightened and this person is not enlightened?
it's a good question, because for every genuine enlightened person there are five crackpots who are trying to pass themselves off as enlightened. And I think if we live with them, um, it becomes very clear very soon whether they are genuinely enlightened or they are just imposters. And some of the criteria which help us to decide are: number one, uh, very deep questions about the spiritual experiences themselves. Because if you have been deep enough on the path, you have read, understood, and experienced a lot of things, you can raise certain deep questions which only a person who has been at depth can answer those questions. So first is those kind of questions. Number two is their own behavior, because you can put up a fake mask for some time but not for a long time. And their own behavior, particularly the bliss, the awareness, the state of no thought and the peace it brings, the clarity of intuition, the quality of thoughts, words, and deeds they do, they give you an idea. Thirdly, the presence or non-presence of mystical powers, which is not a must, but generally it does give you a faint idea. Fourth is the knowledge and the clarity on the path. Because if they have traveled a path, they are very knowledgeable and clear about it in a very calm, peaceful, and a profound way. It is the peace of somebody who knows and knows for certainly that this is true. You don't see the agitation, you don't see the doubt. You see that certainty, that profound calm, that profound peace. And last is actions speak louder than words. If somebody is not enlightened, today or tomorrow he will do something out of his personal desire. And the moment he does something out of his personal desire, we can easily make out, because at that point he is exactly like us. So these are some of the ways where we can make out whether the person that we are thinking or whether what he's claiming to be enlightened is indeed so or is an impostor.
And I believe this happens only after you spend a certain amount of time with such people.
Yeah, so you have to have been in the area of spirituality. You have to have read enough, understood enough, experienced certain things, and you would have to see the world as a mature person. If you are too young, if you are too unread, if you are too dreamy, if you are too naive, then you may not be able to actually make out the difference, and then you can be fooled and taken advantage of, which unfortunately happens with hundreds of people.
Very true. Yes. Uh, Now we come to our last question. How do you see enlightenment, post-enlightenment living, and our understanding it as evolving in future?
Uh, there are two parts here. One is what is enlightenment, what is the path to enlightenment, and then we have how to live post-enlightenment. And the first two parts actually are more academic in nature, because we have yet to understand fully what enlightenment exactly is, because we have so many different descriptions of the same term. So there may be a diversity, a plurality of experiences, or even a hierarchy, we don't know. So the first is conceptual consolidation. The second is empirical investigation. And it is now possible with the advancements in neurology to test out many of the neural states which are being talked about. So what was not possible 20 years back is today possible. The third part is how to accelerate the path of enlightenment. So once we consolidate conceptually on enlightenment, we do empirical investigation of enlightenment. Then the third part is how to accelerate and make easy the process. And there we have to take help of medicine, psychotherapy, holistic healing, Reiki, pranic healing, crystal healing, the ancient Indian techniques of idol therapy, mantra, visualization. And in this particular on this particular point, India is like a supermart of tools and techniques for enlightenment, because the entire civilization has done this thing as the center of its endeavor for thousands of years. So from experimenting with food to lifestyle to use of mantra to visualization to idol therapy to work, all sorts of things have been experimented in hundreds of ways. So that huge traditional knowledge, invaluable and precious, is already there, that we have to consolidate and empirically investigate. So this is the second part. And the third part is living post enlightenment. I think again we have to do the same thing of consolidation and then indexing it to subjectivity. And usually we come down to two paths. The path of withdrawal, that after enlightenment either you do nothing or you do the minimum necessary till you die and the soul never comes back. And the soul has an option of ejecting out of evolution. And the second is the soul comes back for the transformation of society. And the ultimate goal there being what is said in the Veda, to make earth and heaven equal and one. So that kind of conceptual paths are there. We need to think more about them. We'll get some more ideas. We don't have to stop at only these two possibilities. But the core is consolidate together the post-enlightenment lives of all that we know. Empirically try to find out, is there some relationship with the personality and the person choosing that path, or is it just an intuition and an inner call which cannot be predicted and people are following that call? And lastly, if we are to have a designed society and culture, then what kind of post-enlightenment lives would be more preferable for that kind of a culture? And should we then create some necessities which appear as necessities to those enlightened, and they take a particular way or they don't take a particular way? So this sociological cultural aspect of post-enlightenment life for a society or a culture where a comparable number of a substantial number of people are enlightened. So we are essentially then talking of a structure of an enlightened society. So those are the kind of things that uh, some people have thought about. I feel it is just that we have not formally put it all together in the form of a subject. And I feel we need a subject of spiritual psychology which can consolidate this and focus on this very aspect. So just as you have sports psychology, occupational psychology, clinical psychology, one more branch, spiritual psychology, I think it is already there, but not very vigorously worked upon. So that I think has to be sort of refreshed, reinvigorated, and given some more energy and vibrancy. If this area develops, I think it will benefit everyone in terms of our intellectual understanding, our quality of life, and our social organization.
This is a beautiful suggestion. Spiritual psychology.
Yeah,
Hope it can really develop as a large branch by itself in future.
right.
Uh, so, as a part of our psychoanalysis and spirituality series, we come to this very good culmination of thinking of developing spiritual psychology.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Uh, okay. We end here. Thank you, sir. Uh, and today we've talked about this very interesting topic, enlightened people and their life after enlightenment. We'll be coming up with more such videos in our later series. Till then, you can write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.